Greetings, viewers and listeners from the void. My name is Eddie Akiba, and you are listening to the Backlog Gaming Broadcast Company's Impostor Syndrome podcast. And today we're going to be talking about the role-playing game Final Fantasy for the Nintendo Entertainment System. If you're just joining me for the first time, each month I play a different one of my favorite games of all time and talk about it on my monthly podcast called the Impostor Syndrome Podcast, aka the Impostor Syndrome Podcast's Best Games or Best Cast, aka the BGBC on the BGBC. I also host weekly live streams on Twitch and YouTube, during which I not only play the game of the month, but I also play retro games, games from my never-ending backlog, and as well as games from my never-ending RPG backlog. So in this episode, I will try to explain why Final Fantasy for the Nintendo Entertainment System is one of the most influential video games I've ever experienced in my lifetime. It's the game that truly opened my eyes to the possibility of video games, and give me one sec here. Brief movements here. Apologies. It's one of the first games that truly opened my eyes to the possibility of video games as a medium. It's a game that turned me into a lifelong role-playing game fan. And it all happened by accident. So where to start? Again, this podcast isn't a video game history podcast. There are far more intelligent video game historians who have covered the development of Final Fantasy ad nauseum. What this podcast is about how my favorite games have influenced and shaped the story of my life. That being said, for anyone who has never heard of Final Fantasy, which if you're watching this or listening to this, I can't imagine that you have not heard of Final Fantasy, but it's a long-running, mega popular, and at one time industry-leading role-playing game franchise developed in Japan. The very first Final Fantasy, just known as Final Fantasy I, Final Fantasy really, was first released in Japan in December of 1987, the Nintendo Famicom, Family Computer for short. Or Famicom is the short for Family Computer, never mind. Which is known as the Nintendo Entertainment System. In the United States, it was localized and released in North America in July of 1990. So there's more than it first came out in Japan in 87 and doesn't release here until 1990. So that is a big gap in time. We're gonna go do this here. For a game franchise, it is now synonymous with Japanese role-playing game tropes like melodramatic anime-inspired storylines, Japanese role-playing game mechanics like active and turn-based battle systems. The original Final Fantasy was actually heavily influenced by Western tabletop and computer role-playing games like Wizardry and Dungeons of Dragons. Ostensibly, it's a game about a hardy band of adventurers tasked with saving the world and defeating the forces of chaos, visiting towns and castles, exploring a vast overworld, crawling through dungeons, and doing battle during random battles with monsters ripped straight from vintage 1980s Dungeons and Dragons, bestiaries, and monster manuals. The game was developed by the Japanese video game developer Square, which later merged with another Japanese RPG video game developer and publisher, Enix, to become Square Enix, which is now known by. At the time, Square had been enjoying some moderate success as a computer game developer. Not many people know that. Back then, the PC gaming market and console market were two completely different separate markets. Square had some minor success, relatively somewhat success, developing graphic adventure games on the PC, and they even developed a mecha-themed kind of Macross Voltron-esque computer role-playing game. What Square hadn't, from what I understand, anticipated at the time was the success of Nintendo's Famicom, which again is known as the Nintendo Entertainment System here in the United States. which would revitalize the ailing home video game console market, especially in the U.S., there was the great video game crash, and of course, the story is that Nintendo came along and saved North American video game market. It's not as, exactly like that, but they were very significantly influential in revitalizing the video game market in North America. Anyway, so they had been developing PC games, and what they didn't realize was how successful the Nintendo's Famicom in Japan was. It would quickly turn into a license to print money, kind of like here with like the Atari 2600. Everybody jumped on that bandwagon, and we're releasing just games left and right to cash in on that bubble. But like I said, since Square hadn't anticipated that, they were kind of late to the game somewhat in getting into the home console market. So by the time, much like how kids across America would develop a Nintendo fever, people were just eating up games over there now. So you would actually see companies in Japan with no history or relationship whatsoever with video games suddenly open like subsidiaries to try to make games, to try to cash in. Square itself, and this is according to Retronauts. They did a big retrospective on the original Final Fantasy, but it apparently began as an offshoot of a Japanese electrical contractor or utility company, and that's how it first started. But by the time they jumped on that Famicom bandwagon, they were already behind the curve compared to other developers who had already published games for the system. They also struggled with appealing to the sensibilities of console players. The games that they enjoyed success with on the PC were far more graphically advanced than what was possible on the Famicom. And console players were more used to fast-paced, Twitch-style, reflex-heavy action and arcade games on consoles. The complete opposite of what Square was used to making at the time. What resulted was with Square releasing games that failed to make a splash on the market. Some of you might be familiar with Rad Racer for the NES, which was kind of like an arcade-style racing game. Kind of like, if you think, kind of almost like, not pole position, but that kind of like, those styles of games, like those checkpoint games where you'd race and you would have to get to a certain checkpoint by a certain time to continue the race, that kind of arcade-style racer. There's also a famous, somewhat infamous game called King's Knight, which is a kind of a vertical arcade-style shoot-'em-up with a kind of fantasy theme, like a knight, swords, and sorcery kind of fantasy theme to it. Arcade shoot-'em-up would be like, if you think like Galaga, something those lines. Anyway, so a lot of their early games on the NES did not manage to move the profit needle, and the company was on the verge of going out of business. There is a famous story behind this. It's somewhat of mythology. It's not the actual real story, but for the longest time, the mythologized version of the story was that Square decided to release one final game, one last ditch effort to save the business, and they would call it Final Fantasy. The truth is kind of somewhere in between. Final Fantasy's creator, Hironobu, I'm said terribly, I'm sorry. I'm from the rural America in the middle of nowhere. Hironobu Sakaguchi, also known as the Gooch, did decide that if Final Fantasy wasn't a success, he was going to leave the industry altogether and go back to university to pursue another career path. However, the story that he decided to call it Final Fantasy is somewhat romanticized urban myth. He wanted the game to be abbreviated with a certain sound, like in English it would be FF. And originally they wanted to call it Fighting Fantasy, but they went with Final Fantasy though because they were afraid about copyright infringement. Because I think there was it was either like some tabletop game or like books or fantasy novel series that had the name Fighting Fantasy or similar to Fighting Fantasy, and they were worried that they were going to get sued for copyright infringement. So that's why it's called Final Fantasy. Yes, it is true that Sakaguchi would leave the game industry if the game failed, and he was ready to call it quits if it wasn't a hit. So it's not hard to extrapolate Square's chances at continued existence and success in the console industry if their kind of star player quit and left if that game bombed. Not to say that there weren't other people that made Square a success back then, but he was one of the most important factors there, in my opinion. What do I know? I'm a nobody. I'm an imposter. Anyway. So what happened was, facing this reality of we got one more shot at this. So he gathered a group of about 7 core developers to work on the game. The irony actually is that Final Fantasy ended up seeing far more success in North America, at least initially, than in Japan. In Japan, video game players' love affair with RPGs was cemented around NX's Dragon Quest franchise. The first game of which was released in 1986, and was the game that convinced Square to try its hand at making an RPG, following the success of Dragon Quest. The original Dragon Quest, I think it ended up selling after a year on the market 1 million copies. But by Dragon Quest 3, people were, if you go back and look at magazines back then and news stories back then, people were lining up out of blocks outside electronic stores to buy the latest Dragon Quest. They love that game, that franchise. So much, though, that there was this another myth that they couldn't release Dragon Quest games on weekdays because the kids were calling out of school and people were calling sick, which is another myth. But that's how popular RPGs were becoming in Japan. So that's why Square was like, okay, let's try this, and Final Fantasy actually on the Nintendo wasn't Nintendo's first attempt at introducing RPGs to the West. Final Fantasy on the NES was Nintendo's attempt at introducing a Trojan horse in the North American gaming market in the hopes they could replicate Dragon Quest's success from Japan in the U.S. So Final Fantasy in Japan was published by Square. In America, Nintendo themselves published it because they wanted it to succeed. They previously had failed to try to introduce players in the U.S. and North America to RPG genre through Dragon Quest, and they rebranded that game as Dragon Warrior here. They wanted to replicate what was going on in Japan and here in the United States. Unfortunately, by the time Dragon Warrior came out here, it was already old. It looked like you don't really think about it that often. But if you go back and you look at games on the original Nintendo, the first year it was out and the last year it was out, it was night and day. And so that Dragon Quest was one of the early games, not super early, but it was one of the early games. So by the time it got localized and released over here, it already looked old, it already felt old, it kind of played old, so it didn't really catch on. And they even tried to give it away. Nintendo did through Nintendo Power subscriptions as a bonus gift. But they were much more successful with Final Fantasy in North America, partly because of their marketing efforts. And that's really where the story of how Final Fantasy became one of my favorite games of all time begins. How it became one of my favorite games of all time by accident, sheer accident. The story starts with one of my older brothers named Tony. I have 2 older brothers. Tony is the younger of them. He and I are only a year apart. Now, around the time Final Fantasy came out in the U.S., my older brother had a Nintendo. We were already addicted to NES, Nintendo games. we grew up playing Atari, arcades. We would go to the arcades, and so we were very heavily invested at that point in video games. Not heavily. I mean, we were kids. It's what we did to pass time. We had fun. Um, and so, obviously, both of us love video games. The difference is my brother, he loves sports games. That was the difference. My brother absolutely adored sports games. That was his favorite genre. He was kind of the star athlete in the family. He ate, drank, and slept sports, as they say. So, of course, the video games that he loved the most were sports games. Now, unlike modern sports games, back then, sports games were far more. Unlike modern sports games, which are typically these days are these highly complex simulations of professional sports, it's almost like if you haven't played a sports game since the 8 or 16 bit, or even the PlayStation days, and you go try to play like a basketball game or what game have you on modern consoles now, it's almost feels like a flight simulator somewhat. Just how complex the controls. But back then, sports games were far more arcadey and pick up and play. So don't get me wrong, like a lot of those early sports games were really fun. Games like Blades of Steel, Baseball Simulator 1000, Tecmo Bowl, Track and Field come to mind. But for me, for someone who sucked at sports, and a person who has never really been a fan of sports outside of, say, boxing and professional wrestling, aka the greatest sport on earth, sports games weren't really my go-to. I just really thought, like, with all the possibilities of video games, all the cool worlds you could experience, or all the awesome characters you could inhabit, I just thought something about sports games were kind of boring, or not necessarily boring, but unimaginative to some degree. They didn't spark my imagination, per se. Also, it probably didn't help that my brother usually beat me at sports games, like a lot, like all the time. Like 90% of the time. 95% of the time we played sports games, he was going to beat me. So that wasn't very fun. So what do you do? So what do sports games have to do with Final Fantasy? This Tolkien-esque fantasy RPG, you ask? Let me tell you. See, growing up, as every kid is faced with, well, not every kid, but every kid who's a video game fan, and the paradox you're faced with is you have all the time in the world to play video games, but no money to buy them because you're a kid. And then, of course, when you get older, you have, again, all the money in the world to play video games, but you don't have the time to play video games. That's the trade-off. But so for me and my brother, we typically only got new games on our birthday or Christmas. Although, actually, given my parents were extremely Catholic, and I was raised Catholic, not Catholic anymore, but I did at one point figure out a loophole to get a third game every year by giving up video games for Lent. So I kind of worked at a little hustle there to get me an extra game every year. Now, every birthday, though, growing up, our father would take us on the pilgrimage. I just call that. Nobody else called it that besides me. So what that meant was every year my father would take us to the store to pick out a new video game. Unlike today, when you can just simply download a new game on launch day without changing out of your slippers, back in the day, you actually had to go to the store. You had to get in your car and drive to the store and buy a game and hope it was in stock. I didn't grow up in a city, so there were no mom and pop stores or import stores that broke street dates or anything like that. And this is before dedicated gaming retailers like GameStop, Babbage's, your electronic boutiques, your Funko Lands, all before that. Your only options were big box retail or department stores. But this was even before Walmart multiplied and took over the entirety of retail space in North America, or at least in rural North America. Growing up in a small town, our only options back then were Sears, yeah boy, which, believe it or not, was the Walmart of its day. Or the other option was the toy store in our local mall. Uh, Now, despite Sears being one of the biggest department stores at the time, video games weren't yet an all-encompassing mass market medium for entertainment. They were either considered toys or electronics, if you wanted to get fancy. Um, and so at Sears, in my local town, you were lucky to have one display case with Nintendo games. So you imagine you go to Walmart and you see like a display case of video games, like one display case worth of video games. That's what we had at our local Sears. And most of those were like black box black box NES games. Which, if you're not familiar with the Black Box series, those were like the first games that came out for the NES. Those series of games like baseball, pinball, all that stuff. They also did have, other than that, they only really had the mega popular games too. Of course, you had your Mario Brothers, your Metroids, and what have you, your Blaster Masters. But there really was not much of a selection at Sears. Like I said, our only other option in town was KB Toys, which inhabited a space in the mall about the size of a Hallmark store. Now it was small. It did have a large selection of toys and a slightly larger selection of video games than Sears, but not by much more. For the most part, our only real exposure to the expanded NES library were games we rented from various mom and pop movie rental stores in town, which was great. I miss Blockbuster, but I also miss mom and pop video rental places before even Blockbuster existed. It was great. You would have like, I think we had probably like, you would probably have like half a dozen within like driving distance. And every one of them would have a different kind of collection of Nintendo games. So we would often drag my poor mother around on the weekends to these video rental places, and if we didn't see a game we wanted to rent at one, we'd be like, all right, let's go to the other one. So my poor mother, she would do that for us when we were kids, because there's not a lot of stuff to do around where I grew up. Anyway, yeah, so that's really how we got a taste of the expanded NES library. Now, if you wanted to go to the place with the most video games and all of the newest, hottest video games, you had to go on a pilgrimage. I say that jokingly because that's what I'm talking about is Toys R Us, of course, the mecca of home video games back then. The issue for us growing up in a small town was the closest Toys R Us was to where we lived was about 45 minutes away in the next biggest city over from us, if you want to call them cities. Now, today the drive to that city feels like nothing. My father himself spent most of his working career commuting an hour plus to Northern Virginia and D.C. in the D.C. area, so it wasn't very much of a long drive for him. He made it every day. For us as kids, though, driving that 45 minutes in our giant, big, baby blue Oldsmobile station wagon to Toys R Us felt like an eternity. Felt like an epic adventure, much like a party of RPG protagonists setting out to trek the long way to the nearest dungeon. Arriving at Toys R Us, it really was the most magical place on earth for me at the time. You know, where Sears and KB Toys had maybe one or two retail display cases of video games, Toys R Us had display cases multiple rows deep, stretching from one end of the store to the other. And it was Toys R Us was about the size of your, mid-sized Walmart. So like half the store was like video games. And now there weren't any, there were some video game magazines back then, Nintendo Power being the most popular, but for the most part, there were very few review outlets back then. At least review outlets that kids were reading. Really, the only way we picked out games we wanted was based on word of mouth. I mean, one of our friends sang its praises or was talking it up on the playground. We either played it ourselves via like a video store rental, like, this game is so good, we need to buy this stuff, or at a friend's house, or if it was marketed heavily by a Nintendo, uh, or in the majority of cases, honestly, a lot of it was based on the box art. You would go there and you would see Toys R Us and you would see like imagine an entire Walmart store's length worth of games boxes. They weren't boxes then, but like covers. And so you would just like you were like some snooty adult at an art museum. You would just sit there and walk up and down the aisles and look at all the box art. Box art. The issue with that is the difference between the quality of the box art and the actual itself was oftentimes a massive gulf, the size of an ocean in a bad way. So a lot of times it was a crapshoot if you were getting a good game or not, because the game could have the best box art in the world and be crap. So that was, really you didn't know at the time if you were going to get a good game or not. So in the way that worked back then, the box they didn't have boxes on shelves. They had sleeves where they had like the cover of the game, and you could flip it up and look at like the game screenshots on the back. Below each game was a ticket, and if you're lucky enough to see a ticket under the game you wanted, it meant it was in stock. So you brought it to the booth, much like Charlie visiting Willy Wonka's chocolate factory with a golden ticket. There's always some poor retail guy locked in the booth. Then you'd have to go search through all the inventory for the game that you wanted or that you had selected. It was very much this elaborate process. It really was kind of like a ritual, you go pick out the game ticket, you bring it to the guy in the booth, and please, may I have my game? And he would go and he would look for the game. So yeah, it was like visiting Santa's workshop and getting to pick out like your toy. It was magical. This was a time too where there was very little independent video game coverage, and actual firm release dates were kind of hit and miss for games back then. It wasn't like today when a game launches with a specific launch date and it's in every store or on every storefront. Back then, you were at the mercy of like stuff like chip shortages, cartridge manufacturing, logistics. If you were in a relatively small market, you might get screwed over. Just because Nintendo Power said a game had been released, quote, didn't necessarily mean it would be on the shelf of your local Toys R Us day and date. So anytime you walked into Toys R Us, you never knew what to expect, which made it even more awesome. What usually resulted during one of our pilgrimages to Toys R Us was my brother and I meticulously looking at the boxes of countless games until my dad was getting ready to basically lose his patience. For my brother, the vast majority of these trips resulted in him getting a sports game. Now, there were only so many baseball games and football games I could stomach, and these were only among the few games we got each year. So every time we went to Toys R Us, I typically just failed miserably at trying to convince my brother not to buy a sports game. Please buy this cool-looking action game that probably plays like shit. But look at this super cool box art, man. Come on. It's got ninjas and dragons on it. That was until one birthday in the early 90s. It may have been in 1990. It may have been that's when Final Fantasy released. But it was in July. It was in the 90s when my brother picked out Final Fantasy on his trip to Toys R Us. Like, what? What are you talking about, dude? Final Fantasy sports guy? You're picking up Final Fantasy? Looking back, the only thing I can surmise is that my brother was swayed by Nintendo Power's marketing. How so? Well, back then, in the early days of Nintendo Power, subscribers received, I think it was quarterly, in like that first year, like issues that were strategy guides for specific games. One of those games happened to be Final Fantasy. Now, by the time Final Fantasy came to the U.S., it was already a couple years old at that point, and it was fully published and distributed by Nintendo, not Square themselves, like I said. Like I said, Nintendo was desperate to recreate, again, the popularity of RPGs, and specifically Dragon Quest in the U.S. They faced a number of issues marketing RPGs to Americans, or at least American console players, because they thought we were dumb Americans. Um, while a number of the most famous RPG developers in Japan were influenced heavily by earlier Western computer RPGs of the time, like Wizardry and Ultima, and even like tabletop RPGs like Dungeons and Dragons, RPGs as a popular gaming genre, especially in consoles, were pretty much niche to non-existent in the U.S. gaming scene, at least on console. Unlike today, being a nerd or say someone who played Dungeons and Dragons was decidedly uncool back then. This was well before like the rise of nerd culture. Like today, like people say they play Dungeons and Dragons. It's like fuck yeah, it's awesome, right? Um, this if you look at if you watch Stranger Things and everybody's playing Dungeons and Dragons and this was not the Stranger Things era of Dungeons and Dragons fandom. At that point we'd be moved beyond the satanic panic of the 70s that surrounded RPGs and Dungeons and Dragons, and by the 80s, mentioning that at least where I grew up in small town USA, mentioning that you liked RPGs or Dungeons and Dragons in the schoolyard typically resulted in things like the Atomic Wedgie, of course, that's a classic. My favorite was being thrown down stairwells. That was a good one. There was a game they would play where they would like push you in the stairwell and then keep you. The game was to keep you there the whole recess. Basically, that was fun. Yeah, so RPGs at the time where I grew up were considered like the playthings of computer nerds and antisocial weirdos, and this stereotypical basement dwelling recluses. I can't freaking talk. I have a podcast. I can't talk. Which today we know is bullshit because it's okay to like what you like. Who cares? And like Dungeons and like dragons and shit and fantasy stuff is cool. I think a lot of people will agree with me on that. What's not cool about fighting a dragon? That's like awesome, like cool. You can't convince me that's not cool. Wizards? Come on. Wizards are cool. Like, what are you talking about? Grow up. Yeah. But, at the time, that's what, it was a different time to be a nerd back then. Even my father, like, later in his life, he would often brag that, I've never watched an episode of Game of Thrones, and I'm never going to. Like, it was like this badge of honor, and yeah, so while, we here, like, game fans in the U.S. would see pictures of people lining up outside of electronic stores in Japan to buy the latest Dragon Quest, that kind of fervor for RPGs did not really exist in the U.S. at the time. Nowadays, everything has RPG mechanics or skill trees. Everything. Any sort of, like, people, like, pay money to unlock skill trees now. Like, all that stuff is, leveling and battle passes and all that crap. All that stuff is, you don't get that without RPGs. And, but back then, Americans did not like numbers. Americans still don't like numbers. I don't like numbers. I think heights and numbers are my two things or not numbers, but math. Heights and math are probably the two things I'm most scared of. All right. Nintendo themselves had failed once before in their attempt to popularize mushmouth console RPGs in the U.S. Dragon Quest was released in the U.S., but under the name Dragon Warrior, and all the had this cool, like, the dude that did Dragon Ball did the art for Dragon Quest. and he had this cool like Dragon Ball inspired like art. They completely changed that. They replaced it with this generic high fantasy box art. It didn't help, like I said, that by the time Dragon War came out here, it was already considered old. It looked absolutely dated by the time it came out. At one point, Nintendo was like literally giving away copies of Dragon Warrior to Nintendo Power subscribers. But it didn't, like I said, didn't really spark the RPG revolution in the U.S. that they'd hoped for. And part of that was kind of this belief that Americans were just too dumb for RPGs. A lot of games back then had their difficulties adjusted because they thought they were too difficult for Americans. The most famous example of that, of course, is Super Mario Brothers 2. In Japan, Super Mario Brothers 2 looks like a direct sequel to the original Super Mario Brothers. But it was considered too hard for us dumb Americans. So Nintendo took a completely unrelated game called Doki Doki Panic and replaced all like the character arts with characters from Super Mario Brothers, which is if you go play Super Mario Brothers 2, the US version, it's completely doesn't look like anything like the original. Now they've since like re-released the OG actual Japanese Super Mario Brothers 2 here. It's called Super Mario Brothers: The Lost Levels. So you can still play. You can play that, but that's just one of the famous examples of them. Like at the time, like their thoughts on our ability to handle RPGs. Nintendo was far more successful with publishing Final Fantasy in the West. And it later rose to extreme popularity with Final Fantasy VII on the PlayStation. It had a good run on the Super NES. Those are considered the Final Fantasies that came out on Super NES are considered two of the best 16-bit RPGs of all time. But by the 7 really cemented both Square and PlayStation. I'm sorry. It cemented Final Fantasy, not Dragon Quest, as the most popular Japanese-developed RPG series in the West. In Japan, it's still Dragon Quest, but over here, like Final Fantasy to this day is even more popular than Dragon Quest. In Japan, it's always been Dragon Quest, but Nintendo laid the groundwork for that success with the release of the original Final Fantasy on the NES in the West. Part of why it sold so well is because it was heavily marketed by Nintendo Power, like I said earlier. It looked new. The graphics are great. Nintendo Power, it was published by Nintendo themselves. It was far from an unbiased source on video games. It basically was a monthly advertising supplement for Nintendo games. One of the things Nintendo did back then for games they wanted to push was releasing these quarterly strategy guides for subscribers. So basically, every couple months, you basically received an issue of Nintendo Power specifically dedicated to one game. One of those games was Final Fantasy. And that, I think, is the reason, honestly, he'll never admit it, but I think that is the reason I believe my brother, on that fateful day in July, decided to pick out Final Fantasy as his birthday gift from Toys R Us, and changed my trajectory as a gaming fan. I wouldn't be doing this podcast without that game, probably. And my brother was the opposite of a nerd. He was Mr. Sports guy. That Nintendo Power marketing, that must have just got him. And here's the funny part. I'm sitting here today telling you Final Fantasy is among my favorite games of all time. It's one of the most influential games I've ever played in my life. But at the time when my brother picked out Final Fantasy from Toys R Us, I was disappointed. Honestly, it was kind of devastated. Honestly, it was like, man, I almost wish he picked out a sports game. I thought, dude, you wasted your birthday pick on this weird game they call an RPG? It had math. It had numbers. Attack percentages, people. What are we doing? What is this? This isn't Contra? This isn't Super C? This isn't Mega Man 2 or Ninja Gaiden? What are we doing? We only have a limited number of picks. I was convinced we were going to drive the 45 minutes home, play the game for an hour, have no idea what we were doing, and then pack it up, never to be played again. Boy, was I wrong. I knew something was special about Final Fantasy on the ride home from Toys R Us. See, it was customary for us on our way home to scour the gaming manual of the new game we just bought on the ride home. And yes, game manuals used to be a thing. A very, very beautiful thing. Now, most of these manuals are only about like 10, 12 pages, 20 if you're pushing the pages long. But, they include like instructions how to play the game. But also, they also usually had like cool, like unique character art. A lot of times they had game lore that wasn't actually in the game, was only in the manual. Of course, you had your standard section for writing down your tips and tricks and passwords that nobody used. Now, Final Fantasy, on the other hand, again, partly because Nintendo thought Americans were too dumb to understand RPGs, but the original Final Fantasy on the Nintendo came with a giant manual. It must have been like 50, 60 pages long. I could be wrong, but it was thick. It was a thick boy. Half of it was literally a step-by-step guide to get you through to the first quarter of the game, I think. I think there's a town where you go, and there's pirates, which is the second town you get to, I think. Pretty much, if I'm not mistaken. I think the guide has you all the way up to that point. It may even have more. I'm not sure. Yeah, it's a giant-ass walkthrough. And all these detailed instructions on explaining RPG mechanics. I had never seen a manual like this in my life before. It was like finding some magical ancient tome in a treasure chest in an RPG dungeon. I spent that 45-minute ride home reading that manual front to back, and what resulted after that is one of my most memorable gaming summers of my life. Easily top 10 most memorable gaming memories of my entire life is that summer. Every summer that night, after swimming in our backyard pool, now, don't come at me. Yes, we did have a pool in our backyard growing up. Now, that's because my father worked very hard, and he could afford to get a pool for our family, which was amazing because, again, we lived in the middle of nowhere, so really that was our recreation at home in the summertime. We actually have a famous picture of him when he was a kid. He's standing in a wooden bucket with his brother, and the caption is it's an old-timey black and white photo on this farm, and the caption is, look, we grew up with when we had a pool too when we were growing up, or something like that. Basically, my father grew up poor, so his pool was a bucket. But we had a pool growing up. Anyway, back to the main story at hand. So every summer that night, after swimming in our backyard pool, my brother and I would spend those long summer nights, windows cracked, you got a nice breeze coming in, you hear the crickets chirping outside. We would play Final Fantasy in our den on our big CRT TV back then. It was unlike any video game I'd seen before. Today, one of the most popular modern role-playing game franchises is the Elder Scrolls series from Bethesda Game Studios. We're talking about Skyrim, Oblivion, if you're familiar with those games. Ask any fan of Elder Scrolls, Oblivion, or Skyrim what their first experience was like playing those games, and they will regale you with these long-winded, adjective-filled paragraph think pieces about how they first looked out upon this vast open world and that euphoric feeling of realizing that you can go anywhere, wherever you want, whenever you want. For me, For us back then, that's what playing Final Fantasy was for the first time. Was like, it blew my goddamn young adolescent gamer mind, exploring this world that at the time seemed infinitely vast. You know, you go back and you play it now, and it seems kind of small. Back then, this world was gigantic. Just the idea that there was this huge, living, breathing world filled with towns and castles and dungeons that you could travel to in real time was like, it was utterly revolutionary for me. That feeling of there's a whole living, breathing world that exists on this game cartridge, and the feeling that you could literally discover or happen upon anything just over the next screen, or through the next forest, or through that mountain pass. It really felt like being Frodo traveling with Sam and company to Mordor. That's how epic it felt. And I had never experienced anything like this. Up until that point, video games were ports of arcade games, or the games I played were, we're looking at like arcade games where you play to get high scores, sports games, action adventure games where you have, your typical levels or stages, and like outside of like temporary power-ups, your character never grew or changed. Final Fantasy and RPGs were different. Your character gained levels. What is that? That's cool. You can upgrade your character classes. Like you can become a stronger, super powerful character later on. What are you doing? I was officially RPG built. And for me as a kid who got picked on a lot, who sucked at sports, who had remarkably low self-esteem for my age, Final Fantasy really was like a godsend. It allowed me to feel like a hero, ready to save the world. It gave me a sense of adventure, more so than like... And of course, like when you're kids, you would like... Back in the day, you would go explore your neighborhood. I lived on kind of like a really busy street, if you will. Like almost like a state highway. Not really a state highway, but it was like people... You couldn't like walk down the street. You would get hit by a car. We didn't have sidewalks. We ventured forth in like the woods sometimes in our backyard and stuff like that. We did have a big backyard. But Final Fantasy, like, it really felt like gave me that feeling of, okay, this game can transport me somewhere outside of my little teeny tiny town where I'm not having a great time right now and give me this sense of adventure. And I can remember me and one of my friends, we were listening to another podcast about Final Fantasy, during which people were talking about like man on the street type interviews about their experience playing the original Final Fantasy for the first time. And I remember one guy reminiscing about how he would fantasize that as he was walking down the hallways of his junior high or elementary school, I forgot which one it was, you would imagine that he was surrounded by the Warriors of Light, which are the characters from Final Fantasy, which sounds super geeky. And a friend couldn't believe it until I told him that a lot of times for me, like I would stand out on my parents' pool deck and fantasize about the airship from Final Fantasy landing, and the Warriors of Light inviting me on one of their world-spanning adventures. God, I was a bored kid. I was a bored, lonely, sad kid. Cut me some slack, okay? But even like things like just like having the ability to equip different armors or weapons, or the ability to learn different magic spells, and like to pick your own like unique party of adventurers was mind blowing. Even little things like the different swords having different graphics, and just instead of just one stock sword graphic, was cool. If you play the Pixel Remastered, in the first town, there are a group of sages in the inn who give you a tutorial about how to equip items and weapons. And if you think about it today, like when you play it today, you kind of roll your eyes. Like, of course, we know how to equip items. What do you think, we're stupid? What do you think, this is the first RPG we've ever played? Come on. But back then, when the original came out, the idea, even like the idea of like equipping items, was an entirely brand new concept to us. It took us probably a couple times of getting party wiped before we realized you actually had to put on the equipment that you purchased. Like, what's that? That's crazy. I need to dress up. That's cool. The story of Final Fantasy sounds downright primitive to non-existent by today's standards, but back then this was revolutionary. Um, you could even literally save your game because the cartridge had built-in battery backup, which was unheard of us for at the time. Before then, you had, if you wanted to continue your game, you had to jot down these ridiculously nonsensical passwords and codes to continue your progress in the game. Yeah, for Final Fantasy, you just had to press the power button and the reset button at the same time to save your game, which was extremely stress-inducing because there's always a chance that you could have just grinded for 2.5 hours and you just timed it wrong and didn't save your game. But for the most part, it did save the game. The game loop itself is not something you see in today's RPGs either. It's very much laser focused on the game loop of older era retro RPGs, which, again, this was a new genre for us back then. And it was addictive. So, I mean, the game loop basically was you go to New Town. New Town has new weapons and armor. In order to get to dungeon to fight boss, you need to get the best armor and best weapons. You need which meant you had to grind, which means you had to go out in the overworld and fight monsters to get enough enough gold or gil in Final Fantasy's case, to buy those weapons and armor. You buy some health potions, you buy some poison antidotes, and then you head out on that hike to the nearest dungeon. You'd explore its vast confines and just hoped you survived long enough to slay the boss waiting for you at the end of the dungeon before licking your wounds and hoping you have enough healing potions for your battered party to make it back to town. Now you play it like people be like, there's no story in this. I'm just buying items and going in dungeon. But like the game mechanic itself, that loop of the time you invest into preparing to go to the dungeon, going to the dungeon, surviving the trials of the dungeon, defeating a difficult boss, and then on top of that, after you've like survived by the skin of your teeth, this boss encounter, then trying to desperately make your way back to town. You haven't lived until you've played an RPG where you've gone through this rigorous trial of a dungeon that you spent hours on, and all of your party is dead except for one character, and he is on the brink, man. You might have like 2 battles left before you're dead. You might be 1. And you know that you're making it back to town. Town is so close, and you just have to make it back to town. And you do. And that is, for us back in the day, that was like in modern times, when you talk about like Dark Souls or Elden Ring, that dopamine hit of defeating the difficult boss in a From Software game like Dark Souls. For us, that loop of getting to the dungeon, beating the boss, getting back to town in one piece was amazing. It was amazing. Yeah. Now, on stream this month, I played through the Pixel Remaster version of Final Fantasy 1, which, again, Pixel Remaster, they sell them individually, but they do have a collection, which it contains the first 6 Final Fantasy games that were released. It was released on PC and consoles. The remaster of the Final Fantasy 1 gives the game a kind of a 16-bit graphical upgrade with quality of life options like increasing the amount of gold you receive from battles, increasing the amount of experience you gain from fights, and even the ability to toggle random encounters on and off if you just want to do some exploring without being interrupted by random battles every 45 seconds. It also has an option to. There's a fully orchestral soundtrack that they did. They redid the original soundtrack with an orchestral version, but you can change the music back to the original 8-bit version, which, don't get me wrong, if you listen to the orchestral version of the music in the game, it's beautiful, you know. But for nostalgia's sake, I put it on the original 8-bit because there's just something about that 8-bit Final Fantasy chiptune soundtrack that is it's just like a warm nostalgia blanket. You put it on, it's like, it's great. So yeah, there's that. I finished the Pixel Remaster in about just a little shy of 10 hours. The original will probably take you about twice as long, given the lack of quality of life improvements and the grinding that's required in certain parts of the game. This time I played it, I kept the experience point gain the same. Like, I didn't modify that, but I changed the amount of gold that you got. Not gold, gil. It's gil in Final Fantasy. Now, I did do a stream of the original NES version, which you're seeing footage of in the podcast here, if you're watching on video. Up until after you defeat the first boss, the Knight Garland, and you see the title card, which, again, that's crazy. You didn't see title. They had a title card in an 8-bit RPG on the NES. What do you mean by, like, a late title card? That means when you see a movie and there's, like, multiple scenes and then you don't get the title and the credits till, 20 minutes in the movie. They did that in Final Fantasy. You go from the first town, you go to the first dungeon, you fight the first boss, you defeat the first boss. The king builds you a bridge to go to the mainland to continue your adventures. And as you're crossing the bridge, there's this cinematic cut to this full screen graphic of your party in glorious 8-bit pixel art. And it gives you a little bit of flavor text talking about your adventure you're about to embark on. And it actually has a credit scroll of the credits of the makers of the game, which is, again, you did not see that in video games. That is this. This is something, you playing that, you felt like this is really something special. And so, I played the original NES version on stream up until after Garland, and then the first town that you get to after you fight pirates, and you get a pirate ship, and you can sail around. And I went to the first town, which is Elf Town. And I'll say this: the original is still 100% playable and enjoyable today. I really wish the Pixel Remaster had an option for you to switch it back to the original graphics, because I am partial to the original 8-bit graphics. But it's okay. The quality of life improvements outweigh my taste in the graphics. Because the original, while it is super playable today, again, if you don't mind playing older games, it's enjoyable. It does have bugs in the original. Some of the spells flat out don't work in the original. The battle speed is slower. That's the biggest rough part about going about the original, is that sometimes the battles are so slow. And something I don't have a lot of these days is time. Time is a commodity to me. So anything I can do to increase that speed by playing the Pixel Remaster is a blessing. There's also some weird idiosyncrasies from the original that they addressed with later re-releases. But if you want the original untainted, pure experience of playing Final Fantasy 1, do it. I mean, there are far worse retro games that you can play. And I will say this, to me, Final Fantasy is one of those timeless games that I can always go back and pick up and play. Your mileage may vary. If you have no nostalgia attached to the original Final Fantasy, or you're expecting modern day storytelling or plot contrivances, you will probably struggle to enjoy the original Final Fantasy. But if you're a fan of addictive game mechanics, some absolutely fantastic 8-bit chiptunes, captivating 1980s fantasy-inspired graphics on a Nintendo console, Final Fantasy is still infinitely playable today. And that's why it's one of my favorite games of all time. So that's why I decided to do this episode on this. Now, there are going to be some changes to the podcast here in terms of my streaming schedule. Here recently, I've been streaming 5 days a week, and that's not tenable. I did this because I wanted to do it for fun and not have it feel like a job. And it's starting to feel like a job. I did it mainly because I had too much free time and I needed to do something to occupy me because I was going a little stir crazy and I needed something for my creative output. I tend to go overboard with what I think I can realistically accomplish or do or devote my life to, which I've said previously. And I've said previously, it'll be a miracle if this goes 5 years, which I have a 5-year plan for this. But I'm going to still keep doing it. But I'm going to stream less than 5 days a week. Okay. So normally here I've been playing a retro game, a game from my backlog, an RPG, and the game of the month. I'm still be playing a game of the month every month, and I'm going to do a podcast on it, which is going to be the Impostor Syndrome podcast. I'm still doing that. I'm still be playing a different backlog game every month from my backlog. I'm still going to be working through my RPG backlog on the Saturday morning RPG show. But from now on, I'm going to cut my streaming back down to Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays. So I've got the Friday free play on Friday, which is the stream on Twitch and YouTube, where it's kind of dealer's choice. I just kind of play what I feel like that night. Usually it's either the game of the month, one of my backlog games, or what have you. I was doing a retro stream on Thursdays. I'm not going to do that anymore, but I'm going to try to incorporate my retro game playing into the Friday free play. So don't worry, I'm still going to be playing some retro games, and a lot of my favorite games are retro games. So, but as far as retro replay Thursday, I'm going to cut back on that. Again, because if you've been watching me here recently, there are things going on in my personal life. Don't really want to necessarily talk about publicly on stream. I mean, I'm not dying or anything. I have cancer. I'm not going to jail or anything. Nothing bad. I should say nothing bad. Something is happening that's going to remarkably change my life here in the coming future, which is difficult for me that I'm dealing with, and for my own mental health, I need to be able to still do the podcast, play games, have fun, but also, again, not have it to be this thing where I'm doing it 5 days a week, especially with what's occurring right now in outside of streaming and podcasting. There's other more important stuff going on that I need to, not no more important, but there's stuff that I'm dealing with, and again, I can't be doing this 5 days a week. So, so we do the Friday free play, again, that's the dealer's choice. Saturdays, still going to be doing the Saturday morning RPG show. It's Saturday mornings I should say Friday free play that starts at 6:30 p.m. every Friday night. Saturday mornings, the Saturday morning RPG show from starts at 11 a.m. on Saturdays. Saturday afternoons, the Saturday afternoon main event. I usually play the game of the month then, although sometimes I switch it up and play game for the backlog. And on Sundays, I've got the Backlog Blitz at 4 p.m., which again is the game from my backlog that I play. Here also, I have been doing a Monday RPG stream called The Grind. Again, I'm going to cut that, but I'm still going to be, like I said, doing the RPG stream on Saturday mornings. So going down to 1 day of RPGs instead of 2. If things change in my life where I have that time freed up again, I'm going to I might add a day. Maybe I'm thinking about maybe even like doing like an adventure hour at some point during the week, possibly. Right now, I'm going to scale back to 3 days a week streaming, which with basically 4 separate streams during that 3 day window. Then, like I said, on the podcast, I normally record that the second Sunday of every month. I was doing the main podcast, Impostor podcast, and then a bonus podcast called The Best of the Rest. So 2 pods a month. I think I'm going to combine those 2 into 1. So I'm going to have the Impostor Syndrome podcast, where I'm going to mainly focus on the game of the month, but then also talk about the other games I've been playing the month during the main podcast, and only do 1 podcast a month, as opposed to doing 2, which again, given circumstances in my life right now, I can't do 2 podcasts, hold a full-time job, and also deal with stuff that are happening in my personal life. So it's going to be 1 podcast. It's going to be combined into. It's going to be both the podcasts combined into 1. So it'll be the Impostor Syndrome podcast still. So for right now, the Best of the Rest is going away unless I experience some huge popularity or subscribers or something, and you're clamoring for another second podcast. I'm just going to do the. This month, I will still do the Best of the Rest at the end of the month, which is next week. But then starting in May, I'm going to do 1 podcast, and I'm going to do it at the end of the month. So after I played everything at the end of the month, I'll give you what my thoughts are of what I've been playing. So those are my plans as far as that. The other games I've been playing this month have been I've been playing Crystalis for the NES, which is a game that came out in the 1990s. Yeah, it came out in 1990. It's a Zelda-like with RPG mechanics. For my RPG, I've been playing Metaphor Refantasio, which I'll talk about on the Best of the Rest, along with Crystalis. And I just finished tonight, I finished my second stream of Seasons, A Letter to the Future, which is a 2023 adventure game developed by a company called Scavenger Studios, which I've been playing. I really enjoyed my stream of that this evening. I'm going to pick it up and see how far I can get next weekend, see if I can finish it, possibly. It's not a very long game, apparently. I wanted to play more of it so far this month. And in fact, I played it the first Friday free play. And if you watch that stream, it looks like I'm a zombie because, again, something happened in my personal life. I experiencing a loss that is very difficult for me. And Seasons, A Letter to the Future is a game about loss and lives changing and things like that. So I had planned this out previously, like my schedule. This is a game I'm going to play. It just so happened that this big thing that's happening in my life, kind of like I learned of it like the day before. So if you watch that first stream, I played about an hour and a half, and it looked like a deer in headlights. And I was like, I can't play this right now because it's for the sake of my mental health. Is just I can't play this game right now, which is crazy. The game can have an effect on you. Not in any way to say that it's a bad game or anything. It's a fantastic, beautiful, and moving game. It's just at the time the theme was very triggering, and I couldn't deal with it. So, but right now I've had a little bit of time to process things that are going on in my life. Again, not dying, not going to jail, nothing horrible as far as outside of like emotional stuff is happening to me. So I'm going to try to pick that up next Friday. So yeah, the next time I'll stream will be on Friday free play. And I'll be going to play some more Metaphor. So yeah, and the next Sunday I'll be recording the Best of the Rest podcast for the final time until I maybe introduce it later. So if you've listened to this, I apologize. It's a week late again. Big emotional loss type thing happening in my personal life that I'm dealing with. So, had to take a week off for the good old mental health. Gotta promote that positive. Most important thing is for anybody is your self comes first. Make sure you're in a good place. So I think I'm in kind of a good place mentally and emotionally right now. I just need to focus on myself for a bit. Which is why I'm going to be, in terms of like making sure that I come first, and that my mental health, my well-being, my happiness comes first, as opposed to other people. So that's why I'm going down to 3 days. Still going to do this podcast because, God damn it, I've wanted to do this for like years, and I'm gonna stick with it, even though statistically, again, it probably won't make it 5 years. Statistically, I'll be lucky if I get 5 regular listeners or viewers. But it's, this is just me expressing my thoughts. So again, I apologize for rambling. Thank you very much for listening. Again, Final Fantasy, one of the greatest RPGs in my personal opinion. A great story about how the Warriors of Light saved a dying world. The crystals dimmed because of the 4 fiends, elemental fiends, and the evil chaos. Their story of how they overcome that darkness and chaos and restored light kind of is like my mission right now in my personal life. So that's where I'm at. I'm starting here where the crystals are a little dark at the moment, but slowly but surely I think I might be bringing some light back. Hopefully, don't know if that's going to happen. So that's what it is. That's Final Fantasy. Again, great RPG. So I bid you adieu. I wish you good luck. I hope you have a good day. And remember, just be nice, be kind to people, and have a good day. Bye.